So, welcome everybody. Over and over again, people approach me, say, "Look, Rupert, you work in SharePoint. Is there a tool you can recommend? Because my permissions are out of control. I've got files everywhere. Everyone's working in different ways, and I want to get on top of it because mainly, I'm looking at Copilot, or I'm looking at storage issues, or I'm just looking at general, frustration with SharePoint." And the answer is actually a tool's not going to solve what you're going to do. A tool might help as part of that journey, but it's not going to solve what you're going to do. And I think the purpose of this webinar and this video is to help you understand, well, what do I need to consider if things aren't working quite as well as I hope to? So I've asked Ben, who leads our consulting team here, who's hands-on, sees this day to day, speaks to customers about the challenges they're facing. And Ben, really value your input today. If you could run through, where the mistakes are made and what people should be doing instead to help them on this journey to solve those key problems. And as I said before, it's now in focus more than ever that people are running out of storage and that Copilot is getting, a lot more traction. So Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Rupert. So the reality here is that people come to us and they'll say we need a tool to solve these problems, and generally I kind of think the tool itself is not necessarily going to solve the problems, but the problems themselves are valid, and it's what is the right answer to address those problems. So if we look at some of those problems, they are, for example, difficulty finding information, right? People can't find stuff, it's difficult to find. Sites in SharePoint are inconsistent. The use of libraries is inconsistent. There's lots of duplication of documents everywhere, and that leads people to lose confidence that the information that they're accessing is current or correct. And obviously the impact of sharing the wrong document with perhaps a customer is quite problematic, and that then leads people to thinking we're just not comfortable with the idea of rolling out something like Microsoft Copilot because we just can't get our SharePoint estate in the right way. So a tool in itself isn't going to fix these problems, but these problems are what is driving people to start thinking how can we address this.
Yeah, I think from what I'm hearing is the problems are more systematic than that. They go deeper. And then what happens is, I guess people start emailing files rather than using SharePoint because they trust email,
Yeah.
or they create their own workspace called, Dave's area, because Dave's got control of Dave's area and Dave trusts it. And so I do that instead. And that's great until Dave moves on or until somebody else wants to find it and doesn't quite understand how Dave works. And so, these are the challenges. So what's the knee-jerk reaction, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and again, that kind of knee-jerk reaction often will come from IT, I would say, and not to sort of point fingers as such, but they'll think of this as a technology issue and try and address it in a technical way. So yeah, some of those knee-jerk responses might be buying a reporting tool, for instance, and it's going to go and show you all of the challenges that you have with all of your permissions and how confusing and how much oversharing there is. The problem is it's not going to give you any idea of how to go and resolve it. So you're going to get overwhelmed by the amount of information that you've been showing with not necessarily any way of or answer to how to go and address it. There might be an opportunity to try and apply some standardized settings, go and standardize external sharing settings or how sites are spun up, for instance. But applying settings is, again, not the same as standardizing and ensuring that behaviors are adopted consistently. A third and common approach is we need people to be trained, and that's it's a good thing. People do need to be trained, but the problem is that if the structure that they're being trained on isn't optimal, then they're not going to get the outcome that they need. And often what will happen is that the training might purely focus on excuse me, it might purely focus on the technical how to share documents in SharePoint, but it doesn't give any clarity on where should this type of information go versus that type of information. And then finally, they might try and wrap this together and say, we're going to buy a governance tool that's going to address all of these things. But what a tool is going to do is reinforce the structure that you already have. It's not going to design the new structure, and it's certainly not going to change any user behaviors.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I think if you think about it, it doesn't matter how much I lock down. If people aren't saving things in the right place consistently across the organization, then the whole thing falls to pieces. So
So,
user training is going to tell you, how to save and how to work in SharePoint. A governance tool is going to control what sites maybe are created, but you still have to think about where does that information end up and how can I find it again, or am I still just creating problems within my governed area per se? So that's the challenge of this. I think there are there's a role for tools further down the line, and we're going to come on to that. But this isn't going to solve a problem that you've got, which is a bit more fundamental. Um, Ben, I think when we're thinking about this, there's a few, I guess, three forces pushing at each other, right? Where we need to consider what needs to be true for a good SharePoint environment. Maybe just touch on that. That'd be interesting.
yeah, absolutely. So we're kind of introducing this point about when we think about how we organize SharePoint, we're trying to balance three sort of slightly conflicting forces or factors, if you will. And the reason why we're bringing this up now is because often when organizations have got to this point where they have these problems, often it is because they have prioritized usability over and above things like security or scalability. They've prioritized the usability of a really easy to navigate standardized folder structure that looks very similar to their file share, but they haven't taken into account the fact that SharePoint isn't a file share, and therefore we start having problems such as syncing and 300,000 files grinds to a halt, issues with concerns around the security, or perhaps security has become too overwhelming in terms of management and setting it up, and they're taking very much that sort of IT-led approach. As I said, the next part of this is, okay, well, some organizations may then flip and go, okay, well, if I maximize scalability, then everything becomes far too, broken down and partitioned, and it's difficult for people to get from one place to another. And then finally, if you over prioritize security, then everything might be tightly locked down, but people can't find things. Things are too locked down. There are too many information silos, and people revert to doing things like emailing each other again. So, as we said, the reason why we bring this in here is to highlight that often one of those areas will have been prioritized that's led you to this point to experience some of those challenges that you have.
I think an interesting one is usability. So you think about the scenario where somebody has migrated from a file server into SharePoint, and let's say you're on your S drive, everything's structured, and you're thinking from an IT perspective, look, my role, keep the lights on, cause little disruption as possible, and therefore the easy thing to do is to move my entire, 5 GB or whatever it might be into a SharePoint site, and then I can map that back with the sync tool for OneDrive, and therefore really the experience hasn't changed, but I've solved the problem of being able to decommission my file server,
Yeah.
and people can still work in the cloud. And of course, what we know is one giant library does not work. The syncing crashes, it's hard to archive, it's hard to do security permissions, and it's very difficult to work out when files can be retired. So that's, so it becomes a bit uncomfortable to say to people, well, actually, things are going to get a little more, confusing, but actually that's better for us because it's going to be more secure and it's going to be more scalable. So it's a tough sell, and often that's why people bring people from the outside in to do that and tell that story, because see, we've articulated it, hundreds of times. So Ben, and then that kind of leads on to, well, if that's what needs to happen, how do I get there? And I think a lot of people focus on step number two, which is what I'm going to come to or you're going to come to in a second, which is, well, I just need to design SharePoint right. But we know there's more than to that. And what we've done over the course of the projects that we've delivered is understood there's actually 4 key areas which need to be right for this to happen. And I think I had this quote from a workshop that you were doing, which is, for SharePoint to work reliably, 4 things all have to be true at the same time. So it's not a pick and choose. And yes, you might lean towards certain things on this list, but you need all four, and you need to think about it, and that gives you a SharePoint solution which is going to be great from its go live, but it's also going to be great a year down the line. So Ben, without further ado, I shall pass over to you for the big reveal.
Yeah, so let's take a look. So the first and most important is you need business sponsorship within for this new initiative that you're going to do. How is the organization going to support and align so that they can move this forward? And that includes being comfortable that they're all agreed what the problem is, and that they're all aligned and behind this idea of the impact of rolling this out and getting everyone working in the same way. So without business sponsorship, if it's just IT, without business sponsorship, you're really going to struggle. The next thing is we need an appropriate structure. We need an appropriate information architecture, how the information is structured, managed, how we factor in those three competing forces of usability, security, scalability, how all of that comes together so we can get the right structure to move forward that represents how we work. And that leads in quite nicely to recognizing how people work. So these go pretty hand in hand, actually. Your structure needs to align with how people work, but then also you need to make sure that people are on board on the journey. They are brought forward. Everyone consistently understands how to use this structure that's in place, and that is brought together on an ongoing basis. And again, I think that leads in quite nicely to the fourth point, which is around ongoing operational governance. How is this going to stay controlled over time? But also, how is it going to stay consistently adopted? So, as we say, a year down the line, it is just as effective as it was when you started.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how interwoven these are. So if you
Mm.
look at ways of working, training or user adoption becomes a lot easier when you know that you've got the business sponsorship at the beginning saying, this is how we're working now, this is the way we're doing it, rather than going straight in to try and train end users on how you're working already. And the same with information architecture. If that stacks up to the business goals and solving the business problems, again, ways of working becomes easier. And then you bring those first three steps together, drives operational governance, right? You've got the drive from the business. You've defined the structure of how you want the organization to work and continue to work. And you've got people working in the same way, but you're conscious that over time, people will join, people will move, business requirements will change. And that's where the operational governance comes in. So, Ben, that's a great high level. I think we should dive into each of these one by one and just explore them a little bit further.
Yeah, we'll just go a little bit further on these. So we're not necessarily going to go through each one by one, but just picking up a few of these key points. The first thing, as I said, this is a business problem, not an IT problem. IT may initiate and start the process of thinking, how do we deal with SharePoint? But it needs, everyone involved in the process. And that's not just business level sponsorship, but that needs to be at the highest level within the organization, right? People at the top need to be fully on board with this idea, because without their buy-in and recognizing that this is important and it's a problem, when it comes to taking people out of their day jobs to support putting this in place, or making sure that everyone goes through training, or what the overhead there is going to be to get this up and running properly, it's not going to be seen as a priority, and it will slip, and you'll be struggling to get it rolled out. I think from another perspective, just very briefly, this point about accountability. So accountability in terms of the project, but also sometimes the advantage of bringing an external party such as ourselves in is that it gets beyond any potential internal politics that might already be in place. Perhaps there's some perception that IT, maybe they're not comfortable with the structure that's being put in place. We now have to think about how AI is coming into play. We could say, go to something like, Copilot and say, design me the right structure for SharePoint. But the problem is sometimes, those tools don't have the same kind of accountability, and bringing someone else in, I had one customer sort of say, I like to have a neck to ring. That's perhaps not the friendliest way of saying it, but sometimes it is useful to have someone that you can hold responsible to make sure that this new process is going to work. And then the final point around this, I would say, is that taking people on the journey is really critical. Simply going and saying, here's a tool and it's going to do it this way, if people don't necessarily agree or they're not bought in on the process, it's just not going to get adopted. So having people recognize the problem, be led to the solution, properly understand it and get behind it and say, right, this is what we're going to do, that's going to make your engagement much more effective.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. So, firstly, I know when we start workshops, we make sure we've got the right people in the room.
Mhm.
The second thing is often it's the first opportunity people have to actually explain the struggles they have with how things are right now, whether on a file server, whether on using SharePoint. And so bring people in the room, A, to give an opportunity to share that, and then B, often can be the most difficult part is getting alignment on what is the problem we're here to solve. And really, what you'll see is the surface problems, like I can't do this, I can't do that, I don't trust this. But then you go down to, down a few levels that, well, actually, the structure's wrong, and that's causing the problems which you're facing, and the problems that you're facing, the problems that you're facing.
Yeah.
And having somebody in the room who hasn't got the history and can ask all the questions and maybe be a little bit awkward uh, can certainly help. And yes, it may be a little bit painful, but you will get the right outcome at the end of it rather than I've got an assumption of I know what the problem is, therefore I'm going to go and fix it and without getting the buy-in.
Yeah,
So that's certainly
exactly.
interesting. Just before we move on, it's worth saying if you want the download of this, it is on the website and there is more detail behind these slides. So if you just want to scan through the slides, we've got that detail in there. So Ben, let's go on to the second pillar. And we have a lot of videos around this kind of information on our YouTube channel. So the site and hub architecture video is very popular, setting up the right kind of document libraries, a recent one on metadata. So those are all in there. But Ben, at a high level, what are the touch points here?
Instead of without going into the details of this completely, what we're looking at a high level is what type of hubs we might need. Do we need an intranet hub? Do we need a collaboration hub, a projects hub, for example? How do we factor in the differences between publishing, collaboration, and filing that we've talked about in some of our previous webinars? And how does that sort of fit into our standard site templates? Do we need project templates? Do we need department templates? And within those, we've got libraries for working areas, we've got filing areas and those types of things. So that's the sort of base structure. We then start layering in how can we benefit from using metadata to drive a business process, to make things easier to find, either using AI to enhance that or using AI or helping AI become more effective with metadata. And then finally, how do we make this consistent so that as we go through and roll this out, workspaces, they're standard every time, every new project, every new department site looks consistent as I go from one place to another.
And that then answers that sort of scalability question, but also the security piece. And then I think, we'll probably come on to usability next, won't we, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely.
So ways of working is a term thrown around a lot. What does it actually mean?
Yeah, so realistically, what we're looking at here is that we if we purely put in a structure and we don't get people thinking about how they're going to fully adopt it, it's not going to go anywhere. Okay. If we go in and put this new structure, but people aren't brought on board and they might attend some training, but then they go back and they find the shortcuts and they revert back to what they feel comfortable with, then the whole thing sort of falls by the wayside. So simply giving some people some training and say this is how SharePoint works, isn't enough. We need to make sure that training on how to use the tools, but training on how the information is organized, all of that dovetails into when you're going to do your migration. People need to be comfortable that when they come into the office or remotely on the Monday, they all know exactly how they're meant to work, where they're meant to put things, how to use the tools, how to file things in the right way, in the right way moving forward. The other thing I would say, as I said, is that this goes hand in hand with the structure. So the ways of working will be reflected in the structure itself, but then we need to make sure that it's really embraced and taken forward.
Okay. And yeah, it is. interesting that often we get a lot of pushback saying we don't want too many sites because that's going to
Yeah.
confuse people. And actually, when you make it clear of, look, this is the structure and this is why the structure works for you, you do get that light bulb moment saying, okay, actually that makes sense. We do projects, they finish. It'd be great if we could just remove that and archive that, and this support, this process supports that. So I think that's an interesting one. So Ben, we've now got the three, I guess the keys in place to make the project or the enablement real. But how do we maintain that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, this is often the thing where sometimes people will fall down, which is they really focus too much on the project and not enough on what happens afterwards. So the operational governance is really, really critical as well. Um, simply writing a document or a policy that says how you're going to use this tool isn't enough. These tools need to have ownership. If it's an intranet, it needs to have someone that is accountable for its success moving forward. Same thing goes whether it's who's going to manage SharePoint on an ongoing basis. It needs to have some accountability to ensure that it is maintained, moving forward. And with that comes in, how do we start ensuring that the life cycle of SharePoint spaces is being represented? If we've got project sites that just continue and never get shut down, for instance, then all of that information is just accumulating and clogging up space and starting to get in the way of AI, and we're not going to be able to get what we need from it as we move forward. On top of that, for example, one of the things we talk about how AI is impacted by this, but of course, AI is going to start generating information as well. And all of this is just going to become exponential unless you're on top of what your information lifecycle is and how you keep that up to date and how you maintain it moving forward. How we standardize what we're doing with our standards, provisioning standards, making sure that the permission model is the same every time, everyone is comfortable, they know how they're using these tools, it's the same type of template each time. But then finally, again, this just gets forgotten about sometimes, which is you put lots of effort into training everyone ready for day one. And then a year down the line, people have moved on, new people have come on board, people have maybe forgotten things or need a bit of a refresher. So, how do you continue to provide ongoing support and training way beyond the launch of the new SharePoint environment?
Yeah, I think if you look at it, nothing changes, right? People change. They're changing roles. They're joining the organization. The business changes of how, or the organization changes how it does things. And there may be external pressures as well, as like regulatory pressures come on board and things need to change. And thinking that, a SharePoint project is finished when you've delivered it, it's not the case because generally SharePoint solutions are used very broadly across the organization. And because of that, any part of it's going to be impacted by this level of change. So, understanding that these things may be changing internally. It could be people, it could be process, it could be external changes, as I said, regulatory, or it could even be that Microsoft are changing how SharePoint works, and we know that they're developing very fast. There's new features coming out every month, and we do our best to keep on top of those and tell our clients what's going on and how that's going to impact them. More importantly, but yeah, SharePoint isn't done when it's done. It's an ongoing investment, but hopefully with this, and you've got the right structure in place to be able to land those changes well within your user community. Now, at the beginning of this, we talked about, look, a tool isn't the answer, but there is a role for tools, Ben. But it comes maybe not when you're expecting it, or not by themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, where do tools fit? So we kind of see three high-level categories of tools. I think the first is, enablement tools. They're the things that are going to help you get into this new structure. So once you've designed how you want it to work, they will help you migrate the data into this new environment, or perhaps restructure the data from your existing SharePoint estate into the new one. The next is governance tools. So they may say, once you've got this structure in place, how do you use tooling to maintain it and keep it up and running? Now, as we said, governance is not just documentation, it's not just tools as well. However, there is a place for tools to help you maintain a consistent, life cycle provisioning model, permissions model, etc., etc. And then finally, there will be tools that sit on top of SharePoint to provide slightly more business focused specific scenarios. So for instance, policy management, we have our own tool, which is Policy Express, that would sit on top and provide the standardized workflow for approvals and managing your policy lifecycle. But other tools could be such as knowledge management systems or learning management systems that again would sit on top of SharePoint as that sort of base layer.
Yeah, and I think with all of these, tools are part of the solution. So a data migration tool is part of moving your data maybe from a your file share into SharePoint. But other things you need to consider is like, well, how are we going to structure that information? How are we going to train people? So it fits part of a problem, but it's not going to do it by itself. As
Yeah.
Ben talked about governance tools and say site management, that only works when you define well what your site strategy is going to be, and then that can help you implement that. And then you think about solutions. So I'll talk about Policy Express, which is our solution. So it's easy to reference. But that only works once you've agreed that you're happy to put all your policies in one hub, because that's the way to manage it. And that is actually the best way where people can find things. So that confusion around is the expense policy in the finance site or is it in the HR site? It doesn't matter. It's in the policy hub. So there still has to be thinking and agreement and alignment before these tools come into play. So Ben, interesting session. I think what I'd like to do is just summarize what we've talked about today, and hopefully people found this useful. So number one, you talked about business sponsorship, and this what turns it from a IT project into something which is going to impact the whole organization and impacts it in the right way, in a positive way, and in a way that everyone's on the same journey. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing being information architecture. So how do we design something which then supports the problem we're trying to solve, the problem that we've identified with our sponsors? Now, supporting that and going on from that is then thinking about our user community, so the ways of working. Um, we know that parachuting in, trying to do some training and disappearing isn't the answer. But if you've got your business sponsorship saying, no, this is the direction of travel, you've built the right solution to support that, then the ways of working and landing adoption training becomes a lot easier. And then the final point, we talked about the ongoing operational governance. So how do we make sure this great thing that we've created together is going to stay great and deal with the changes which come on, and it's not going to mean that we need another SharePoint project in 3 years' time to sort out that degradation which has happened over the last 36 months. So I hope you found that useful. If you're looking for a conversation around SharePoint, some of the challenges maybe that you're facing, or maybe you see opportunity as well, and it's just like can SharePoint do this? Well, the best way to find out more is just jump on our website, informationexp.com, and then there's book a discovery call. Click on that button, and that will pop you straight into my calendar, and we can have a conversation and explore a little bit further about what you're up against, and we can share some insight and experience of maybe how that might look and how we could potentially take that forward. So hope you found it useful in today's session. Take away those 4 key pillars. Think about SharePoint project isn't just technical, it's bigger than that. But Ben, thank you for your time, and look forward to doing the next one.
Yeah, thanks very much. See you next time.